You won't believe what happened when Karen, the self-proclaimed queen of our HOA, took things too far and crossed a line she couldn't come back from. Before we dive into today's story, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe so we can keep bringing you amazing stories like this one. Living in a homeowners association, HOA, neighborhood was already frustrating, but things escalated when Karen, the self-proclaimed queen of the HOA board, decided to take her authority to extreme levels. She had always been a menace, patrolling the streets as if she were law enforcement, issuing ridiculous fines for things as trivial as having a garden gnome or parking 1 inch outside the designated driveway zone. As a cop myself, I'd always found her antics amusing, but never thought they'd directly impact me until the day she took things too far. One evening, after a long shift, I was pulling into the neighborhood when I noticed something strange. A makeshift police checkpoint at the main entrance. There were orange cones, a stop sign, and even a flashing light on a tripod, though it wasn't an actual police cruiser. I slowed down, confused, and that's when I saw Karen standing in the middle of the road wearing a reflective vest, clipboard in hand, stopping cars one by one. She motioned for me to stop, and when I rolled down my window, she put on her best authoritative voice, saying, "License and registration, please." At first, I thought she was joking, but her stern glare told me otherwise. "Excuse me," I asked, arching a brow. She huffed impatiently. "This is an official checkpoint, and I'm authorized to ensure everyone in this neighborhood complies with our traffic safety rules." I barely held back a laugh. "Karen, you're not law enforcement. You can't run a checkpoint." She scowled. "The HOA has granted me special authority." That was a new one, even for her. Before I could argue, she leaned closer and glanced at my dash cam, which was still recording. "Are you recording this?" she snapped. "You're not allowed to record an official checkpoint without authorization." That's when it hit me. Karen wasn't just overstepping. She was impersonating law enforcement, something that was very illegal. I played along for now, handing over my ID, watching as her face twisted in confusion. "Wait a minute," she muttered, reading it over. But instead of backing down, she doubled down. "Oh, I see. That doesn't exempt you from HOA rules. And you were speeding." I blinked. "No, I wasn't." She smirked. "I clocked you." I glanced at the ridiculous toy radar gun she had strapped around her wrist. It was clearly something you'd buy off a cheap gadget website, nowhere near accurate or legal. "Karen," I sighed, "you need to move these cones before you get yourself in serious trouble." Her nostrils flared, and she scribbled furiously on her clipboard. "You're getting a citation." She tore off a slip and shoved it at me. It was an HOA fine for reckless driving. My patience wore thin. You can't enforce traffic laws, and you definitely can't fine me for something that didn't happen. Her smug grin returned. "Oh, but I can. And if you don't pay up, we'll take legal action." At that point, I knew she had no idea who she was dealing with. Deciding to let her dig her hole deeper, I feigned submission, taking the ticket and pretending to inspect it. "I'll handle this through the proper channels." She mistook my compliance for submission, nodding in satisfaction. "Good. Maybe next time you'll follow the rules like everyone else." I rolled up my window and drove off, already planning my next move. Karen had crossed a line, one that had serious consequences. She didn't know it yet, but her little operation was about to be exposed in the worst way possible. As I pulled into my driveway, I replayed the dashcam footage, making sure I had everything recorded. Karen had created an illegal checkpoint, falsely accused residents of speeding, and issued unauthorized fines. This wasn't just an HOA overreach. This was criminal behavior. I made a few phone calls to some colleagues and planned to address the situation legally. Karen had built a kingdom of control, but she was about to learn that her false sense of power had serious repercussions. Before taking any action, I decided to gather more evidence. The next day, I watched from my window as she continued her checkpoint, stopping cars and harassing my neighbors. Some residents seemed intimidated, while others tried to argue, but Karen was relentless. I noticed a few elderly residents reluctantly paying fines on the spot, not realizing that none of this was legal. My blood boiled. She was scamming people and abusing her position. That afternoon, I confronted one of my neighbors, Mrs. Thompson, an elderly woman who had lived in the neighborhood for over 30 years. "Did Karen fine you?" I asked gently. She hesitated before nodding. She said I was going 5 miles over the limit and that if I didn't pay, the HOA would sue me. My jaw clenched. This wasn't just about me anymore. Karen was preying on people who didn't know any better. I assured Mrs. Thompson that she wouldn't have to pay anything and that I would take care of it. I called up a lawyer friend who confirmed what I already knew. Karen had no legal authority to issue fines, set up a checkpoint, or impersonate law enforcement. In fact, her actions could be considered fraud, false imprisonment, and even extortion. I compiled all my evidence, dashcam footage, witness statements, and the bogus ticket she issued me. Then, it was time to make a move. I returned to the checkpoint that evening, this time off duty, but armed with knowledge and the law on my side. I pulled up, rolled down my window, and waited for Karen to give me the same routine. "License and registration," she demanded. I smiled. "Sure thing, Karen. But first, I'd like to ask you a few questions." Her expression faltered. "What are you talking about?" I pulled out my badge and held it up. "Karen, do you realize impersonating law enforcement is a serious offense?" Her face drained of color. I'm not impersonating anyone. This is an HOA checkpoint." "No, it's not," I said calmly. "You have no legal authority to stop residents, issue fines, or demand identification. What you're doing is illegal." The realization hit her like a truck. "You can't arrest me," she shrieked. "I'm not under arrest yet," I said, watching her squirm. "But I have enough evidence to take this to the authorities. And trust me, they will take this seriously." Karen started backpedaling immediately. "Let's just forget about the ticket," she stammered. "It was a misunderstanding. But it was too late for that. I had what I needed." This was only the beginning. Karen's reign over the HOA was about to come crashing down, and I was going to make sure she faced the full consequences of her actions. The day after my confrontation with Karen, I felt a surge of anticipation. I knew it wasn't enough just to expose her. I had to ensure that the HOA board, the very group that had given her the illusion of authority, understood the full extent of her actions. If I could get them on my side, I could not only put an end to her petty reign, but also hold her accountable for the harm she'd caused to so many of our neighbors. The HOA board meeting was scheduled for that evening, and Karen would be there. The board's meetings were usually routine, with brief discussions about neighborhood landscaping, the occasional discussion about a homeowner's fence needing repair, and minor disputes. But this time, I was going in with a purpose. Armed with my dashcam footage, witness statements, and the legal knowledge I had gathered from my lawyer friend, I was ready to bring Karen's tyrannical actions into the light. I arrived early, preparing myself mentally. I wasn't going to be the lone voice crying out in a room full of people loyal to Karen. Some of the board members were more neutral, but I had a feeling there were those who had grown weary of her overbearing attitude. I would need to appeal to them while simultaneously dismantling Karen's credibility. As I entered the meeting room, I noticed Karen sitting at her usual spot near the head of the table. She had a smug look on her face, still convinced she was in control. I could almost hear her thinking, "No one can touch me here." But that would soon change. I quietly took my seat, nodding to a few of my neighbors who gave me reassuring glances. They knew what was coming. One by one, the rest of the board members filtered into the room. As the meeting began, the usual pleasantries were exchanged, but I was focused on one thing: getting the board's attention. Karen wasted no time asserting her dominance. She immediately began reporting on neighborhood safety, which, to her, meant enforcing her personal rules. "I've had to issue several citations for reckless driving, and I've set up checkpoints to ensure the safety of our residents," she announced proudly, her voice dripping with superiority. The board members nodded, but I could see a few exchanging skeptical glances. It was time for me to speak up. I stood, my voice steady but firm. "I need to address something that's been happening in our neighborhood. Karen has been running unauthorized traffic checkpoints and issuing fines that have no legal standing. She's impersonating law enforcement and preying on residents. This needs to be stopped immediately." The room fell silent. Karen's face went pale, her mouth opening and closing as she scrambled for a response. That's not true," she sputtered, but I could see the panic creeping into her eyes. I didn't let her derail me. I walked to the front of the room, making sure I had the attention of every single board member. I have dashcam footage that proves Karen set up a fake checkpoint with cones, a stop sign, and even a flashing light, claiming to enforce traffic rules. She stopped residents, demanded personal information, and issued fines under the guise of the HOA. This is fraud, and it's illegal. I passed out copies of the footage to each board member, ensuring they could see exactly what had transpired. There was no denying it now. I watched as they reviewed the footage, their faces growing increasingly serious. Several board members looked at Karen, who now seemed to shrink in her seat, desperately searching for a way to defend herself. One of the more level-headed board members, Mr. Garcia, spoke up. "Karen, this is a serious accusation. Do you have any justification for your actions?" Karen, now visibly sweating, tried to maintain her composure. I was just trying to keep the neighborhood safe. I have the HOA's best interests at heart. I'm protecting us from reckless drivers." Mr. Garcia wasn't buying it. "You can't just set up a checkpoint. You're not law enforcement. This is a violation of the law and the trust we've placed in you." I could see that Karen was starting to unravel. The board members, once her loyal followers, were now turning on her one by one. Mrs. Henson, a longtime member, leaned forward. "Karen, this isn't the first time you've overstepped. You've been fining people for having garden gnomes or parking slightly outside their driveways. It's been a pattern of abuse." The tension in the room grew thicker. It wasn't just about the checkpoint anymore. It was about the entire atmosphere of fear and control that Karen had cultivated in the neighborhood. And the board members were starting to realize that they had been complicit in her reign. Karen's face turned beet red as she stood up abruptly. "This is an outrage," she yelled, her voice cracking. "You can't turn on me like this. I've been keeping things in order." But it was too late for her. The board members were no longer listening to her frantic defense. They had seen the evidence. They had heard from their neighbors, and they were done enabling her. Mr. Garcia cleared his throat. "Karen, effective immediately, your role on the board is suspended. We will be investigating your actions further, and you will be held accountable for any illegal activity." The weight of the decision hit her like a ton of bricks. For the first time, Karen didn't have an answer. Her smug confidence had shattered, and the room was filled with a palpable sense of justice. The board members had done the right thing, and I couldn't help but feel a sense of relief. Karen's days of terrorizing the neighborhood were officially over. But that wasn't the end. The legal process would take time, and there was still the matter of the fines she had illegally issued to residents. I was prepared to help anyone who needed support, and I was ready to ensure that Karen faced the full consequences of her actions. Once the HOA board made the decision to suspend Karen, the wheels of justice began to turn. It wasn't enough for me to simply stand up to her within the HOA. I had to ensure that Karen was held accountable for her criminal actions. Impersonating law enforcement, issuing fraudulent fines, and causing undue distress to my neighbors couldn't go unpunished. I knew the legal system had to be involved to ensure she faced the full consequences. After the HOA board's decision, I took immediate steps. I filed a formal police report presenting all the evidence I had collected, dashcam footage of Karen's checkpoint, witness statements, and copies of the bogus citation she had issued. The footage alone spoke volumes. It was irrefutable. Karen wasn't just overstepping her boundaries. She was breaking the law, pretending to be something she was not, and causing harm to the residents in our community. The investigation began swiftly. Karen, who had previously wielded her HOA authority like a weapon, was now on the receiving end of scrutiny from law enforcement. I knew that Karen's ego wouldn't allow her to admit guilt, so I expected a long, drawn-out battle. Still, I was determined to make sure justice was served. As the police delved into their investigation, it became clear that Karen's actions went far beyond what anyone had imagined. The first step was gathering more testimony from residents who had been victimized by her. Many of them were elderly or lived alone, and Karen had preyed on their vulnerability. People like Mrs. Thompson, who had been targeted with the fake speeding tickets, were now coming forward to share their stories. Karen's pattern of issuing fines for the most trivial reasons, ranging from garden gnomes to parking a few inches outside the driveway, was all part of her quest to control the neighborhood and impose her will on others. Karen had always prided herself on being in charge of the community. She had used the HOA as her personal domain, but she had never expected someone to stand up to her. As the investigation unfolded, it became apparent that she had manipulated her position for months, perhaps even longer, under the guise of keeping the neighborhood safe and enforcing HOA rules. But the reality was much darker. She had crafted a fantasy of power, one that allowed her to extort money from residents, intimidate her neighbors, and create an atmosphere of fear. And now, with law enforcement involved, it was clear that she would be held accountable for all of it. I kept in close contact with the police throughout the investigation, offering whatever help I could. I provided further evidence from my dashcam footage and gathered additional witness statements from my neighbors. It was important that we build a solid case that could not be easily dismissed. One of the key pieces of evidence came when I contacted the local attorney general's office to get some insight into the legal ramifications of Karen's actions. My lawyer friend confirmed what I had already suspected. Karen's behavior constituted several serious crimes. Impersonating a law enforcement officer was a felony, and the fraudulent fine she had issued could be classified as both extortion and fraud. Additionally, her harassment of residents, especially the elderly, could lead to charges of false imprisonment and coercion. Karen had truly crossed a line that few would have ever expected from someone serving on the HOA board. The situation began to escalate when the police issued a warrant to search Karen's home and personal belongings. They found more damning evidence, a series of documents detailing her ticketing practices along with a collection of the fake fines she had issued. The radar gun she had used to claim drivers were speeding turned out to be a cheap, non-functional piece of plastic, completely useless in determining anyone's speed. She had been passing it off as an actual tool of enforcement, making false claims to intimidate residents into paying fines. Karen was arrested in the middle of the investigation. She was taken into custody, but in typical Karen fashion, she continued to deny her wrongdoing. She claimed that she was only trying to maintain order in the neighborhood and that the fines were for everyone's safety. But when the police confronted her with the overwhelming evidence, the dashcam footage, witness statements, and the fake radar gun, there was no escaping the reality of her actions. The legal process moved quickly after that. The local district attorney filed charges against Karen for multiple offenses, including impersonating a police officer, fraud, extortion, and harassment. As the charges were brought against her, it was clear that the consequences would be severe. She faced up to several years in prison, and the court proceedings quickly became a spectacle, drawing attention from not only the neighborhood, but also local media outlets. The story of the HOA tyrant who had gone too far was now front-page news. But for me, the most satisfying part of this process wasn't the media attention or the public shaming of Karen. It was the fact that the people she had preyed on, the elderly, the vulnerable, the intimidated, were now getting the justice they deserved. I made sure to keep in touch with Mrs. Thompson and other residents who had been affected by Karen's actions. Many of them had paid fines they couldn't afford, too scared to challenge the authority she had fabricated. It was my goal to make sure they got their money back. As the trial approached, Karen's lawyer tried to negotiate a plea deal, but the charges against her were too severe for any leniency. Karen's reputation in the neighborhood was already beyond repair, and no amount of legal maneuvering could change that. The evidence was clear, and her attempts to downplay her actions were met with skepticism at every turn. In the courtroom, Karen's behavior was as dramatic as ever. She pleaded not guilty to the charges, but it was obvious to everyone watching that she had no defense. The testimonies from residents were powerful and emotional. People spoke of how Karen had harassed them, frightened them into paying fines for things as trivial as a slightly crooked mailbox or a slightly untidy garden. It became clear that Karen's actions weren't about enforcing rules. They were about control, manipulation, and greed. In the end, Karen was convicted on multiple charges, including fraud, impersonation of a law enforcement officer, and extortion. The judge sentenced her to a significant prison term, but more importantly, She was ordered to pay restitution to the residents she had scammed. The total amount was substantial, but it was the least she could do to make up for the damage she had caused. The aftermath of the trial was bittersweet. The neighborhood had been forever changed. People no longer feared the HOA or Karen's overbearing presence. But the damage she had done, both psychologically and financially, was not so easily undone. Many residents were still recovering from the anxiety she had instilled in them, and some continued to struggle with the impact of the fines they had been forced to pay. However, the sense of justice was palpable. Karen had been held accountable for her actions, and the power she had once wielded so freely had been stripped away. For me, the satisfaction came from knowing that justice had been done. Karen's reign of terror was over, and the community could finally breathe a collective sigh of relief. I had done what I set out to do: protect my neighbors, stand up for what was right, and ensure that someone who had abused their power would face the consequences. The neighborhood could now rebuild, knowing that there were people willing to stand up to injustice, no matter where it came from.